This is Art Talk, and I'm Pamela Bond, and today we have a slightly different form of program. It is an exhibit. We're going to show you an exhibit, and I have with me Debra Fillos, who is the curator, the chief curator and assistant director of the Florence Griswold Museum. And our show has to do with an exhibit, the William Chadwick exhibit at the Florence Griswold Museum, which is already over. And it's the result of one of the members of the Florence Griswold Museum asking if something couldn't be done for the handicapped. She is handicapped and couldn't get up the stairs of that marvelous museum. Wonderful curving stairs, but very difficult for the handicapped. And so we decided, at her request, to do a picture of the show, to do a show of the exhibit. And Debra Fillos, who was the curator of the show, is here to tell us all about it. I think you think this is a good idea, don't you?
Oh, I certainly do. The first floor of the museum is accessible to the handicapped, but unfortunately we're unable to provide access to our second floor due to the nature of our historic building. So I think this is a great idea.
I do too. Sometimes access rather ruins a building. I suspect that at some time the Florence Griswold Museum will have an annex for
We certainly
shows.
hope so,
Yes.
and I think that would make things much more easier for people of all ages.
Yes. Well, the museum and the Historical Society are now combined, are they
Yes.
not? And they
Yes.
both use the same facilities.
Right now we do.
Yes. Well, it is, as you know, I'm very much in favor of the Florence Griswold and what it does in the community. And I've always liked William Chadwick. I think we all have.
He's always been one of the favorites at the museum.
Yes, there was a show there, what was it, 1978 or a little later?
I believe it was 1980, Connecticut
1980, was it?
Connecticut American Impressionism.
Yes, and Mr. Love, I believe, wrote an introduction.
Oh, that exhibition, the R.H. Love show.
Yes.
Yes, that was in 1978, and it was the first traveling exhibition of William Chadwick's work.
Yes, and that seems strange, doesn't it? Because after all, he died in '62.
Yes.
And he stopped painting perhaps in the 50s.
I believe in 1959 he stopped painting.
I see. So it was, what, 20-odd years before, I'm not very good at mathematics, before there was a full exhibit of his work.
Yes, and but the exhibit at the Florence Griswold Museum was the first real museum retrospective. The exhibition that you're speaking of was organized by a gallery in Chicago, the R.H.
Yes.
Love Gallery.
Yes. And it was an excellent show, as I remember, perfectly beautiful and attracted enormous crowds.
It did.
And then it went on to New Britain, was it? I believe there were 3 shows.
Yes, and actually traveled around to another site in the Midwest. I'm afraid I don't remember the exact sites that it went to. But we, in the meantime, have acquired a large collection of William Chadwick's work at the museum, and we were just thrilled to have the opportunity to do it again, particularly now that we have the William Chadwick studio on the museum property.
Yes, exactly. That
which
has
just
made a
opened last year.
Well, yes, I remember when it opened, and it is a lovely studio. We should have it in this. Actually, we have shown it, haven't we, on this program?
I believe we did, yes.
Yes. Well, William Chadwick himself was rather a shy man, wasn't he?
I believe so. We have many photographs of group activities during the art colony days at the Florence Griswold House, and he's rarely one of the people playing the games or the horseshoes.
Yes.
Or I think he was quiet and spent a lot of time by himself. And although he did like to paint with friends, he liked to go on painting expeditions, but I don't think he liked being the center of the party.
I see. Well, we are now going to see a film taken on location at the museum of the show, and Debbie will tell you all about it, and if you listen carefully you'll learn a great deal, not only about William Chadwick and the paintings, but about art itself. So on to what we call the Biro.
Porch by William Chadwick is perhaps one of the best known paintings that this artist has done. It's one of the most favorite images that everybody comes and asks for when they come here to the Florence Griswold Museum. It was an early work when he first started coming here to the Florence Griswold house, which was in 1902. The artist chose a model, professional model, to sit on the back porch of the museum, and it combines really two styles of painting. It's sort of a transition piece between a darker palette that he used in his earlier career and the very impressionistic style that's shown in the back of the painting with the gardens and the use of light and shadow. This lovely impressionist painting of Hamburg Cove here in Lyme, Connecticut is another famous image by William Chadwick. This one, owned by the Museum of Fine Arts in Springfield, has graced many reproductions that you may have seen around the community. I'm particularly intrigued by this painting because it has a couple of unusual features that many members of our audience pick up, particularly the tree stump which the artist chose to leave in the front of his painting. I think it's particularly important because it's sort of what I call the hand of man. It's a way of having a landscape painting, but yet reminding the viewer that this is not a totally natural audience. This is a landscape where people live and work. Still life with Chinese porcelain is an example of William Chadwick's early work, a more traditional style of still life painting which was probably painted around 1900. What is unique about this painting is that the 90% of the items in the painting have been retained by the owner of this painting. So it is just extremely unusual that over 90 years later we're able to view both the subjects as well as the painting itself. William Chadwick started painting at the Art Students League in 1898, where he studied for 6 years. He concentrated primarily on figure painting. This is perhaps one of the finer examples of his early career, although it was done probably circa 1908, 1909. The subject eventually became his wife, and she was Pauline Bancroft from Wilmington, Delaware. The palette that he used with this portrait is typical of his early career, a lot of use of browns, greens, ochres. The composition is also very stylized, strong use of arms to bring the viewer's eye in exactly the direction they want to go. There's no second guessing what the viewer is intended to see. The portrait is, interestingly enough, was probably done in his New York studio, and we have examples of the ginger jar and the chest, which is seen in a number of the portraits, as well as the still life, which we've seen earlier. The next portrait is of William Chadwick's father, Day Chadwick, and was painted shortly before his death in 1915. Very typical of his early work, primarily concentrating on the face and not as much on the figure of the drapery. Although there is a very strong fabric backdrop, which may well have been wallpaper in the home of Mr. Chadwick's father. I particularly like this painting to the right called The Orange Fan. It depicts a model in Mr. Chadwick's New York studio. Wonderful use of orange, salmons, and greens to complement each other. And then a very nice S-curve pose and composition that the model is seated in. On the Water, painted around 1900, is slightly different for William Chadwick. It was probably painted during the summer when he first went to England. He traveled throughout England to visit his old family homestead in Yorkshire. It's a rather typical turn-of-the-century landscape, but it's atypical because it's not the type of work that he continued to paint. The scene could be England. It also looks like the lowlands of Holland as well. This work is also slightly atypical for William Chadwick. It's entitled Gertrude Canning, and we believe that he used his sister Gertrude as a model. This is an example of work that Chadwick did probably between around 1905 and 1910, when he made a living after his Art Students League days as doing commercial illustration for magazines. He also at the same time taught art at the City College of New York. It's interesting because probably the white space in the back would have been used as the bare space for the writing in the magazine advertisement. William Chadwick first started coming to Old Lyme in 1902 for his summer vacations, and they were painting holidays. They weren't all leisure. He stayed at Florence Griswold's house every summer almost between 1902 and 1915. This wonderful interior scene depicts Florence Griswold seated on her unusual Eastlake sofa in the middle of her parlor. It's an early example of his work in sort of a transition between figure painting and interior and a landscape tradition, that he's experimenting with the light coming through the window, but still the main focus of the painting is just on the figure in the center of the work. He also experimented with landscapes that we can see in the next work. It's entitled Pepperidge Trees, which I believe is another name for the sour gum tree. It's a lovely work that was probably done in Old Lyme. Two Women in a Hammock, or One Woman in a Hammock, painting owned by the Lyme and Allen Museum in New London, is, again, he uses his two sisters, Gertrude and Florence, as models. It's probably painted in Holyoke, Massachusetts, where they lived. The next work on the wall, Lady in White, is strongly reminiscent of his early teachers. He was taught by Joseph de Camp at the Art Students League, and this painting and the composition of the woman on the rocks by the water is very typical of the Boston School of Painting, of which de Camp was a member. We're not sure who the model of this painting is. It might have been a friend, but he probably visited the Massachusetts coastline when he was taking summers in Holyoke. In this lovely painting entitled The Red Kimono, William Chadwick has depicted his new bride, Pauline, Bancroft Chadwick, sitting at leisure in one of the wicker chairs that he commonly kept in his studio, intimate pose, tying her bodice. It's a lovely work. It's one of the typical examples of the American Impressionists, however, as well. Women at leisure, women reading, women contemplating a flower, women sitting gazing at landscapes. These are all common themes for the American Impressionist artist. And with William Chadwick, his favorite model for many years was certainly his wife, Pauline. In this painting entitled The Ginger Jar, William Chadwick has again used his wife, Pauline Bancroft, as a model. This is a wonderful painting in terms of the color and the use of texture in the backdrop. Also, you'll notice that the Japanese themes are very prevalent in this painting. the ever-present ginger jar that's common in, you'll see in many of his paintings, the fan on the table, the colors of the floral pattern in the back. Japanese influence was extremely prevalent in the late 19th and early 20th century. William Chadwick was very fond of it. He used it in a lot of his work, and also the habit of using artists in kimonos, the slightly asymmetrical pose, she's slightly off-center in the painting, are all aspects of Oriental influence in William Chadwick's work, as well as other American Impressionists. William Chadwick painted many landscapes in Old Lyme. These are two very fun ones because they depict the same beach, Griswold Point, and they are depicted probably within 5 years of each other. One of the interesting things about this painting is in the oil painting on the right, there's a very large rock right on the shore. It's always fun to see this rock because now the erosion on Griswold Point over time has caused this rock to now be approximately 100 feet out into the water. So it's a great conservation feature showing how our shoreline has changed. But it is also it's very loosely painted. Obviously meant to be a sketch. He created several views of this beach. Not as finished as many of his other works, and I think he intended to keep it that way. The watercolor is not quite as loose as the oil painting, but the colors are wonderfully vivid with the blues and the greens and the reds and the purples of the bathing costumes on the people sitting along the beach. Obviously meant to be highlighted more than the water in the background. This is one of my favorite paintings in the exhibition. It depicts Rockford Village, which is a section of Wilmington, Delaware. William Chadwick and his wife, and eventually their child, John, often went down to Delaware to visit her parents, the Bancrofts, who were wealthy mill owners in the Wilmington, Delaware area. This depicts mill houses running along the Brandywine River right near the family mills. It's an interesting perspective, because you're looking down at the top of the houses as opposed to a more typical view of looking straight on the houses with the landscape in the background. There's actually really 3 levels to this. You're first looking at through a sort of a veil of trees in the foreground with the wonderful brick of the houses behind, and then perhaps a fall or landscape beyond that. William Chadwick often used a veil of trees as a conceit in his paintings, but possibly it's something he learned from Charles Hassam, who also used the same device in his paintings.
Well, I think you will agree that that was a very interesting show, and that's only half of it. We will show you some more later. But first I'd like to ask Debbie a few things or make a few comments. We're very lucky because she did give a lecture at the museum, as she often does with special exhibits, and we've got it both. We've got the show and the lecture. Debbie, what did you think of the Japanese period, the one of his wife in her sort of rather Japanese outfit, her hair up, her costume and everything? When was that done?
Most of those paintings were done from about 1905 to 1915. However, the Japanese theme was very common in a lot of American Impressionist paintings. The interest in Japanese motifs really came in after the 1876 exposition in Philadelphia and carried through for about 3 decades at least.
Yes, I was aware of that, and the Chinese pottery and such, but I thought she looked rather Japanese in that picture. It's almost as if he's aged her and changed her face. Her face is almost the shape of Miss Florence's in that picture.
In many ways it is, yes. You're right. But, well, you're right, he has somewhat aged her. I don't think that was intentional, but I think it was also just a fairly common way of wearing one's hair, sort of poofed on top of one's head, and I think he was just very attracted by that look.
Well, I wonder if she liked it. She may have hated that picture.
That's a good question. I have no idea.
Well, the whole show was simply splendid, And I'm so glad we have some more to look forward to. And now I think we must wait a moment while we have a public service message, which is about New London.
Art is a process that fills our lives. See it, enjoy it. This public service announcement is brought to you by the Griffis Art Center, New London, Connecticut.
There is art everywhere, as I'm sure you will agree. I find Mr. Chadwick a very interesting person. I'm not aware that there are any biographies of him. Are there?
No, there aren't. There was other than the information given in the exhibition catalog prepared by R.H. Lev in 1978, there have been short biographies written in other exhibition catalogs, but there's not been a singular work, no.
I think it would be rather fascinating. Artists in those days were, some of them anyway, luckier than others in that many of them did not have to work, did not have to have a job other than their own art. He didn't sell. He was a fairly well-to-do young man.
Yes, he tried to sell, but he just was not as popular as some of the other artists for some reason. I'm not honestly sure why. He did have the assistance of his family, as also the family of his wife, which was very helpful. I don't think he wanted it to be that way. I think he would have preferred to have sold more of his work and been more successful commercially, but it just didn't happen.
It just didn't happen.
No. There is a body of work, though, that the family is going to be publishing soon. There's a series of letters written during the 3 years that William and Pauline were traveling in Europe, and they're a wonderful set of letters describing the development of his painting while there and their adventures traveling through Europe right before World War I. So those letters probably will be published within the next year.
Oh, good. Is the museum going to do that?
It won't be we're going to certainly assist, but it's not going to be a fancy book, but the information will be available to the public.
Well, that's good, and the letters will show so
they're
much
wonderful.
more. Yes, yes. Well, yes, he did sell a bit. Obviously, that picture that you showed of the Canning, his sister-in-law, I believe it was.
His early commercial work.
Yes, that obviously did sell.
Yes.
Probably quite well.
I think he made a fairly good living when he was working, doing commercial art from, I believe, 1905 to 1910. Many of the artists did that. They did illustrations for magazines and books, Harper's Brothers and other publications. But it wasn't the goal of every artist to do that for the rest of their life.
No. Well, his father and his father's brother came over from Yorkshire in the late 19th century, and had, I believe, a woolen mill, specialized in those sort of blankets you wrapped around your knees in open cars.
I believe so, yeah.
Or possibly not in open cars in those days, they probably got horse carts and such. But they must have wanted him to go into the business, don't you think?
I would think so, but apparently they were very supportive of his art career. I have never heard anything that they didn't encourage him, and he went straight to New York right after high school to go to the Art Students League, and there doesn't seem to have been any urging to stay, try it out for a year, or try it out for 2 years in the family business.
Well, that's unusual, isn't it?
I think so, but perhaps there were other members of the family who were maintaining the business, and
well, his father, I suppose, was young enough anyway to keep on for a while, and then his...
There were cousins as
yes.
well.
Oh, I suppose so, yes. But a father looks rather dour in that portrait, and I would have thought he was the sort of man to say, young man, art is all foolishness.
He might have.
Yeah.
That was also painted right near the end of his life, and he was quite frail at that point. But you're right, he seems fairly stern, but I think there's a twinkle in his eye.
Oh, good. You would know. Well, I was fascinated, as you know, by the painting that we call possibly, I call it a Dutch period, the marine.
Yes.
I love marines anyway. It is quite different from his other ones.
It is. I feel it was probably done early on in his career, probably about in the late 1890s, or circa 1900. It's a much more traditional style of painting, what he would have been learning from the people he studied with at the Art Students League.
But it's beautifully done, though, isn't it?
It is beautifully done, and I think that he went through quite a bit of experimentation, not as broad experimentation as we might see among artists today, but he tried out many different types of painting and landscapes, and he may well have been in Holland or England when he painted that.
Yes, I expect he was. Well, let's go on to see some of his European paintings, which come next in our location film.
In 1912, William and Pauline Chadwick had an amazing opportunity. They were able to spend 3 years traveling through Europe so he could paint. She was also a pianist, and she was able to spend her time taking singing and piano lessons. But it was very important for William Chadwick's career because for the first time in many years he was able to concentrate just on painting. He didn't have to teach anymore. He didn't have to do commercial work. He spent a lot of time for the first year in Italy and then traveled on to Austria, Paris, and ultimately St. Ives in England. This painting depicts probably a typical street scene in Rome where he spent approximately a year. The interesting thing about his time in Europe is that this probably depicts just before he went through a change in his painting style. After about a year in Rome, his style really brightened up. It became, he was much more conscious of the play of light and shadow on his work. This is evident in this painting as you're going through the darkened street towards the brilliant light of the village beyond, but it's still not quite as vivacious and brilliant as some of the works that you'll see painted along the Adriatic coast. After Rome, the Chadwicks traveled on to the county or region called Dalmatia, which is along the eastern shore of the Adriatic coast. At the time, in 1913-14, it was part of Austria. It now has been part of Yugoslavia in recent history. The area, the town's called Ragusa, and I'm going to forget the other name, were very impressive sites for William Chadwick. We're lucky enough to have letters that he and his wife wrote back to her parents during their travels, and they were quite taken with the landscape, the rich blue and turquoise of the sea, the rough rocky coasts, and the dramatic fortresses that were built along the water. This shows a real departure for William Chadwick because, for once, he's not focusing on a figure or a house. He's focusing on rocks in the foreground, and this is a dramatic change for him. He's focusing on aspects of the landscape and the light being reflected off the rocks and the water. In Dalmatian Village, painted in 1913, William Chadwick again is choosing a coastal view of the Adriatic. I think his feeling for light is truly coming out at this point. He's been in Europe for about a year, and I'm sure he's just enormously attracted to the coral roofs of the buildings, the rich blues of the boats, the water, the composition of the tall, spiring buildings. It's really at this point that his palette is truly brightened, and he really maintains this color palette for most of his life. This little Moroccan scene is quite fun for William Chadwick because it shows a looseness of brushstroke and an interest in the passing figure that was not common for him. He was more inclined to take a model and pose the model in front of an exact composition that he was interested in. This, however, shows men bustling around a village scene in Morocco, a scraggly tree in the foreground before a hut, and just shows a great deal of interest in the average everyday life of the European scenes that he was confronted with for 3 years. Tropical Harbor reflects scenes from Bahamas, Bermuda, that William Chadwick was lucky enough to be able to paint each winter. He visited the Caribbean with his friend Wilhelm Foote. Also, his friend Clark Voorhees had a house at Bermuda. Harriet Hoffman, another artist friend from the Art Students League days, also traveled down to the Caribbean. I'm sure that William Chadwick was very attracted to this area because the light and the coastline were very similar to what he had found in the Adriatic, an area he liked so much, but had to leave quite suddenly because of the outbreak of World War I. The colors are just dramatic in this. The light shining off the white roofs and buildings, the shadows of the trees dappling the roofs, and the stucco work is really quite remarkable. And it's a painting that is very popular amongst visitors to the museum.
In one of these descriptions of the paintings, you suggested that the painter had painted it this way because he wanted to show what the viewer was intended to see. And I think we often forget when we look at these marvelous pictures, these truly wonderful things, that it is flat. It's a totally flat board, and all the tricks it takes to produce this three-dimensional effect. Don't you find that very interesting?
Oh, it's fascinating to see how they've created the depth of field, and how they draw your eye through the picture, and just composition is I especially admire it since I'm not an art painter myself.
Well, that's unusual, isn't it? Have you tried to do any painting?
I've just started learning about a year ago.
And you know how difficult it is.
I really appreciate how much more difficult it is.
Yes. I think the painters of the past had more interesting things to paint. Women's clothing, I'm thinking of, and rather wonderful backgrounds, frills and furbelows and textures and such. But contemporary artists, of course, wouldn't agree with me, but I do think that today's painting is somehow flatter and less interesting than the painting of just the century before.
I would agree with that. I certainly agree with you about the more of a concentration on textiles and fabrics at the turn of the century, and certainly in women's fashion helped that, but there was certainly, within interior design, was much more elaborate than it is today. And
yes.
It's lusher.
Lusher, that's a very good word for it, yes. And the lushness appears in his photographs, or rather his paintings of Barbados, Bermuda, the islands. That was a wonderful picture, that one we ended on.
Oh, I love
Isn't
that.
that fabulous?
Tropical Harbor, it's
Yes.
really a wonderful painting. And he just loved it down there, the light and the
Yes.
and the brilliant light and shadows and colors. And I'm sure that's what attracted him down there quite often.
Well, that particular painting with all that white in it, it's extraordinary that it can be so vibrant, so wonderful, and there is so much white, which normally isn't.
Well, I found that with his use, I mean, his whites usually aren't that white. There's a lot more
Right,
color
yes.
mixed in, and adds a little bit more depth.
Well, he knew exactly what he was doing. I'm sorry he didn't sell more. I'm sure a great many people are sorry they didn't buy more.
Yeah.
But you say the museum has a lot of new acquisitions now.
Right now we have an exhibition of new acquisitions. We have not acquired any new William Chadwick paintings recently, but we do have a large collection of his work that we hang on a rotating basis.
Mm-hmm. And this was, these were acquisitions or?
These were gifts from the family.
Yes, that's nice.
We're
That's
just
what
thrilled
we
by
need.
that.
Yes, that's what we need. And of course, the family can't keep up with all these paintings. I mean, you have to have a very large house to hang these things.
That's true.
So it's beautiful for them to be able to share them with others.
An opportunity for visitors to see the rich variety of his work.
Yes, and I think this film will help a lot more people see the rich variety of his work. We're going on to show some more of his wonderful pictures. This lot, I think, is possibly more varied and ends up, they're his flower pictures, many of them, and which you know well, of course. And we will end up, I believe, with the Congregational Church,
Yes.
which was so frequently the focus of painters in those days, and is still now.
William Chadwick loved to paint the landscape on painting trips with other artist friends, particularly Will Howe Foote and Harry Hoffman, who he made friends with at the Art Students League in New York, and all three of them settled their families here in Old Lyme. The Orange Bridge is a popular image. It's very reminiscent of a J. Alden Weir painting of the Red Bridge that was painted in another part of Connecticut. William Chadwick loved to experiment. I think he was intrigued and tickled by the idea of trying to capture scenes and vistas that his other friends had captured. That has a very stylized composition. It's extremely, the strong lines of the Red Bridge spanning the water, the Orange Bridge, sorry, and then with the strong shadow below, creating a Z-like pattern, which really forces your eye through the painting. In 1915, William Chadwick and his wife Pauline purchased a Greek revival home in Old Lyme and settled here for the rest of their lives. William Chadwick ultimately died in 1962, and he was able to paint until through 1959. This meant that William Chadwick could experience all four seasons in Old Lyme. He concentrated his efforts on landscapes, such as this fall scene called the White Birch. This is a interesting composition. It's more like a T-shaped. He's got the strong horizontal lines of the rocks on top of a hillside, yet right in the middle of the painting is this slightly, it's hard to tell if it's a dead birch or whether it's just one without leaves. But it's a very common scene in the Lyme landscape, and one that he painted more and more. I've seen many sketches of this typical scene, rocky hillsides, either in spring or in fall, and just constantly painting and painting trees and using the shadow of the trees to help reinforce his composition. painting entitled Irises is perhaps one of the best of William Chadwick's later landscape paintings. There's extremely strong asymmetrical composition and very broad, loose brush strokes, and a color palette that's just extremely high-keyed that's very typical of his later career after about 1920. We're not quite sure where the painting was painted. William and Pauline Chadwick had flower gardens which they cultivated on their own property, and he still came over to visit Florence Griswold and her property quite often, so we like to think it was either one or the other here in Old Lyme. The interesting thing is looking at the lower right-hand corner of the painting where there's extremely broad brush strokes, and then as you move further back into the distance, the painting becomes much tighter and it becomes much more impressionistic, but the brush strokes are tinier and tinier, and your eye is just led off into the distance. At the same hand, there's extremely strong horizontal lines that are brought in through the rows of different color irises that are depicted in the painting. All told, William Chadwick painted in Old Lyme for 60 years, starting in his first visit here in 1902 until his death almost until his death in 1962. He continued to paint his favorite themes over and over again, and one of them certainly was the mountain laurel. Mountain laurel is the Connecticut state flower, and it blooms in profusion along the river banks and in through the woods in the Connecticut region, primarily in June. And this is a slightly different painting for him. He's not chosen to use a water vista in the background, but rather it's just a walk through the woods surrounded by laurel. I think that one of the attractions to laurel was they had the strong color of the pink and white of the blossoms, which was variegated. At the same time, there was the light that could reflect off the blossoms and the leaves, and the shadows falling across the path were subjects that fascinated Chadwick throughout his later painting career. The Congregational Church of Old Lyme was a favorite subject of many of the Old Lyme artists, and particularly William Chadwick. He painted a number of views of this church. This is a particularly interesting view because it's one that was quite similar to a view painted by the early artist Childe Hassam. It's a very strong, dominant building, and William Chadwick has chosen to paint it through what we called earlier a veil of trees. He's letting the landscape intermingle with the architecture of the building and creating a very impressive facade, which to this day is a popular site for photographers and artists. William Chadwick also donated several of his paintings of this church to the Congregational Church of Old Lyme, as well as to other institutions throughout the community, including the library, town hall, and the Episcopal Church. It's a strong edifice. It's a nice reminder of the long career of William Chadwick in Old Lyme.
Well, what a nice ending. It was a most lovely exhibit. There is more to it. We couldn't show them all, but I think this was a lovely idea, and thank you so much for cooperating.
Well, thank you so much for filming the show. It was wonderful.
Well, it was wonderful. It's a lovely show, and it's a great opportunity to remember and think back on the pictures. We mentioned the Art Students League where he went to school. The Art Students League was responsible for a lot of very good artists, and many of them came to Old Lyme, didn't they?
Yes, a great many did. Perhaps because Frank Vincent Dumont started to bring summer school classes up from the Art Students League in about 1903, I believe.
Oh, really? Yes.
Or perhaps 1902. And he was assisted by Will Howe Foote, who was a great friend of William Chadwick's, which is how William Chadwick was introduced to the area. But a great many of the over 200 artists who were associated with the art colony at Old Lyme study at the Art Students League. A few also came from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts School through teachers such as Henry Rankin Poor, but most of them came up from New York.
And a lot of those actually bought houses, a lot of those
Yes,
artists.
a large number of them ended up settling in the community. William Chadwick, Will Howe Foote, Harry Hoffman, Clark Voorhees, George Burr, Charles Ebert, I could go on, Gregory
Yes.
Smith. You're right, a very large number ended up settling, and which is why the arts community is still so alive, I believe, in Old Lyme today.
Yes, and of course, if it hadn't been for the Florence Griswold boarding house at that time, we might not have had them all. I mean, where else would they have stayed?
Well, there were 2 hotels in town,
Were
but
there?
Boxwood, which is now condominiums, used to be a hotel.
I didn't know
And there used to be, the Old Lyme Inn was run on a previous site over on
Oh, of course it was, on Ferry Road. Yes.
But it didn't accommodate as many people, and it was probably much more expensive for
I
artists
thought
to
so.
stay, so it was much more feasible for them to stay at the Griswold house.
Yes, well, where did the students stay, the ones that came with Dumont, or did they just come for the day?
I think they would come for at least a couple of weeks. Many probably stayed at the hotels, but I probably people opened up their homes and rented rooms in a bed and breakfast type manner,
Yes,
much as
yes.
people do today.
Yes.
The community was not well off, and I'm sure was attracted by the opportunity for additional income.
Yes, yes, I suppose so. It's hard to think of Old Lyme not being well off. It seems so well off today.
The latter part of the 19th century, it really went into a financial decline, as many small towns did during the Industrial Revolution. And it was really the influx of the artists in 1900, as well as the development of the beach community, that brought prosperity back to many of these shoreline communities.
Yes, and then they were hit by the Depression, but I think the artists, most of them were not. Am I right about that?
My sense is that most people got through the Depression, the artists, fairly well. There doesn't seem to have been much of a decline in the work produced, or the amount of sales, or the number of artists who were attracted to the community.
I see. No, well, they came actually from New York, didn't they, to look at this art and
Yeah, they would
the
have
exhibits.
Posters for the exhibitions would advertise the train times from New York to Old Lyme, and trains came much more frequently through the community than they do now. So in some ways it was a lot easier to get up here from New York than it is today.
And there was a station in Old Lyme, was there not?
Yes, there were 2 stations actually.
Imagine, yes.
So it
Yes.
made life a lot easier.
Yes, and more difficult in some ways. We can be grateful, I suppose, to Henry Ward Ranger, really, for starting the whole thing.
Yes. He came in 1899. There were other artists who came before him, but he was really the one that attracted the artists to form an art colony at Florence Griswold's house.
Yes.
And we're truly grateful for him for being the visionary behind the colony and what Old Lyme had to offer, as well as the Griswold house.
Yes, well, we're much more aware, I think, of William Chadwick's art today than we are of Henry Ward Ranger's. It was probably, he wasn't a flash in the pan, I can't say that.
He's a very popular artist of his day, but his style of painting, what we call a tonalist style, darker palette, is just not as popular right now, and it'll have its day again.
Yes, I suppose so. William Chadwick did, after all.
That's
He
right.
lay in obscurity for a long time.
That's right.
And it is beautiful art, and we're grateful to have this chance to share it with you, with our audience. We hope you will listen again next week when there will be another Art Talk program. And today we thank Debra Fillos, Curator, Chief Curator, and Assistant Director of the Florence Griswold Museum. And thank you also for your expertise in sharing it with us.
Thank you, Pamela.
Bye.